Most people hear the word economy and they immediately tune out. They picture a wall of numbers they don't understand or headlines that feel disconnected from real life. But that's the first mistake. The economy today isn't some passive backdrop. It's not scenery. It's the terrain every major conflict is being fought on. Because deregulation, globalization, inequality, these aren't dry policy debates anymore. They're forces that are reshaping how nations compete, how societies function, and how ordinary people live day to day. They're driving political instability, inflaming social divisions, and determining which countries rise and which ones fall. We talk about power as if it's military fleets or political parties. But increasingly, power is economic. And the side that controls the rules of the system controls everything else. That's why the world feels so volatile right now. It's why everything seems interconnected. A banking crisis in one country rattles markets across the globe. A supply chain breakdown thousands of miles away raises prices at your local store. A trade dispute between two world powers or between the U.S. and everybody else on the planet suddenly reshapes entire industries. These aren't isolated events. They're symptoms of a global economic order that's stretched to its breaking point. And if you really want to understand why so many societies feel like they're teetering, why people are angry, why politics has destabilized, why governments are struggling to respond, you have to look at the underlying economic pressures that have been building for decades. Because the truth is simple. The economy isn't background noise. It's the battlefield every nation is fighting on, whether they admit it or not. So in this episode, we're stripping away the jargon and getting right to the heart of it. How deregulation set the stage. How globalization created new vulnerabilities. How inequality became a systemic risk. And how all of these forces collided to create the world we're living in today. If you want to understand the crisis, you have to start here. So let's start with 2008 because that's where the modern story really begins. Most people remember it as a financial crisis, a bad recession, a few banks collapsing, a wave of foreclosures, and a government bailout that supposedly kept things from getting worse. But that's the shallow version. What actually happened in 2008 wasn't just a downturn. It was the exposure of a system that had been hollowing itself out for decades. For years leading up to the crash, finance had been deregulated to the point where the most powerful institutions in the world were basically gambling with the global economy. Complex derivatives, subprime mortgages, credit default swaps, financial weapons disguised as innovation, huge profits on the way up, catastrophic losses when the bubble burst. And because everything was interconnected, one sector's collapse didn't stay contained. It cascaded across the globe. But the real damage wasn't just economic. The real damage was psychological. It broke the illusion that the system was stable, competent, or even fair. People watched the largest financial institutions commit fraud, implode, and then get rescued with public money, while ordinary families lost their home, lost their savings, and were told to tighten their belts. That was the moment trust eroded, maybe for good. And how did governments respond? Not with investment, not with reform strong enough to prevent the next crisis, but with austerity. Across Europe, across the USA, across much of the world, the message was the same. We have to cut. Cut public services, cut social supports, cut wages, cut pensions, cut everything except the system that caused the crisis in the first place. Austerity didn't stabilize society. It destabilized it. When you strip away opportunity, when you squeeze working families, When you create economic insecurity that lasts for years instead of months, you create resentment. You create anger. And that anger doesn't just sit quietly. It moves. It looks for someone to blame, something to change, some outlet that promises to break the cycle. That's where the first sparks of today's populism came from. Left-wing populism promising to challenge elites and rebuild the social contract. Right-wing populism promising to punish the vulnerable and restore a mythic past. Different ideologies, same roots. A sense that the system was rigged, that the institutions were unaccountable, and that no one in power was actually listening. So when we talk about 2008, we can't reduce it to numbers or charts. It was the hinge point, the moment when deregulated finance, reckless speculation, and deep inequality collided, and the fallout reshaped politics, trust, and global stability. Everything that came after, the polarization, the anger, the movements that reshaped entire governments, starts right there, in the ruins of an economic model that finally hit its limits. Globalization was sold to us as the great efficiency machine. Build things where it's cheapest, ship them where they're needed, and let every country specialize in what it does best. On paper, it sounds like the foundation of a stable, interconnected world. But in reality, it created a level of fragility that most people didn't even notice until it was too late. Because when you stretch production across dozens of countries, when a single product depends on components from half the planet, you aren't building resilience. You're building vulnerability. You're creating a world where a drought in one region, a flood in another, or a labor strike halfway across the globe can stall entire industries. We saw it with semiconductors, with medical supplies, with food, with fuel. A disruption in one link of the chain doesn't stay localized. It echoes outward, and suddenly it feels like the whole system is starting to fall apart. Now here's where it gets dangerous. Once governments realized how dependent their rivals were on those chains, supply lines stopped being just logistical systems. They became leverage. They became tools of pressure. In other words, they became weapons. Think about energy. European dependence on Russian gas wasn't just a trade relationship. It was a geopolitical choke point. Russia knew it. Europe knew it. And when tensions rose, that pipeline turned into a strategic threat. The same is true with rare earth minerals, pharmaceuticals, microchips. Materials that only a few countries can produce at scale. Whoever controls those choke points controls how the global economy breathes. But it's not just deliberate pressure. Sometimes it's accidental scarcity that becomes a weapon. A major port closes because of a natural disaster or a pandemic, and overnight, billions of dollars of goods are stuck in limbo. Shelves empty, prices rise, and governments get blamed for something they can't fully control. Instability turns inward, not outward. And in the wrong hands, or even just tense hands, these chains can be manipulated. Delayed shipments, export controls, sudden embargoes. Quiet pressure behind the scenes. None of it looks like traditional warfare. There are no armies marching, no bombs dropping. But the economic impact can be just as severe. Nations can be weakened without a single shot being fired. That's the world we live in now. One where the ability to shut down a supply route, deny access to raw materials, or manipulate the flow of goods is as strategically important as an aircraft carrier. A world where logistics has become geopolitics, where container ships and critical minerals matter as much as troops and tanks, where the line between economic competition and economic warfare is getting thinner every year. We used to think of supply chains as boring infrastructure. Today, they function like arteries in a global body, and cutting off an artery has consequences. If you want to understand modern conflict, you don't just look at military maps. Look at the flow of goods, because that's where power moves now. After 2008, governments around the world made a critical choice. Instead of rebuilding the economic foundation that had just cracked apart, they started cutting. They cut public spending, they cut worker protections, they cut social programs, they cut taxes for billionaires. They cut anything that wasn't considered essential to propping up the financial system. And while the language was dressed up, tightening belts, living within our means, the reality was pretty simple. The people who had nothing to do with causing the crisis ended up paying the price for it. For millions of families, the consequences were immediate and personal. Jobs didn't just disappear temporarily. They disappeared permanently, shipped overseas or automated away. Wages stagnated in places where they didn't fall outright. Local hospitals, schools, and transportation systems, already stretched thin, were pushed to their limits. And instead of recovery, many communities entered a slow, grinding decline that lasted for years. That environment is fertile ground for something powerful: populism. Not because people suddenly became ideological, and not because they woke up one day wanting to blow up the political system. Populism rises when people feel abandoned. It rises when they look at the institutions that are supposed to protect them and they see indifference, or worse, contempt. When the promise of stability has been broken enough times, people stop believing in the old rules and start looking for someone who's willing to tear them up. That's exactly what happened. We watched it unfold on both sides of the political spectrum. On the left, movements emerged demanding accountability, economic fairness, and an end to the concentration of wealth and power. On the right, anger was channeled towards immigrants, cultural outsiders, and global institutions. Different narratives, different scapegoats, but the same underlying force: a sense that the system was rigged and unresponsive. This is the key point. Populism isn't irrational rage. It's the logical response of a society that feels like it's been pushed to the margins. When economic foundations erode, political foundations follow. And the consequences ripple far beyond domestic politics. Populist governments renegotiate trade relationships. They challenge long-standing military alliances. They reject international norms that once felt sacred. And they reshape the tone of global diplomacy. Not gradually, but abruptly. In other words, austerity didn't stabilize the world after 2008. It destabilized it. It created the anger that fueled Brexit. It created the conditions for multiple nationalist movements across Europe. It shaped elections in the United States, Latin America, and beyond. And it set the stage for a global political landscape that looks increasingly fragmented, increasingly unpredictable, and increasingly hostile to the old economic order. So when we talk about populism today, we're not talking about a fringe reaction or a temporary outburst. We're talking about a structural response to a system that stopped delivering for large segments of the population. Populism is an alarm bell. And if we ignore why it's ringing, we're going to miss what it's trying to tell us. While Western economies were still trying to patch up the damage from 2008, China was moving in a very different direction. Beijing didn't wait for the global financial system to stabilize. It didn't buy into the austerity narrative. Instead, it went outward, aggressively. And the centerpiece of that strategy was the Belt and Road Initiative. On the surface, Belt and Road looked like an economic development program: ports, highways, rail lines, energy grids, industrial hubs. Thousands of infrastructure projects across Asia, Africa, Europe, and even parts of Latin America. But if you stop at infrastructure, you miss the point. Belt and Road is about building a new kind of global influence. the kind USAID used to do. It's about rewriting the geography of power. And here's how it works. When China funds a port in Sri Lanka or a railway in Kenya or a fiber optic network in Central Asia, it's not just providing loans. It's embedding itself into the economic architecture of those countries. Over time, those nations become integrated into China's trade routes, China's technology standards, and eventually China's political orbit. It's a long game, a patient one, and it's reshaping regions that Western institutions once dominated. Because, unlike the old post-war order, built on institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and the US dollar, Belt and Road offers something different. Fast money, fewer political strings, and the promise of development that Western powers either neglected or took for granted. For many countries, especially those sidelined by globalization, that offer's hard to refuse. But with that money comes leverage. When a nation relies on Chinese financing for its major ports, its transportation networks, its energy grids, or its digital infrastructure, Beijing gains a real say, sometimes quietly, sometimes not, over how that country positions itself on the world stage. Trade agreements shift. Voting patterns at the UN shift. Alliances shift. And the West knows it. Belt and Road is a direct challenge to the Western-led financial order. It's a challenge to the dominance of the dollar. It's a challenge to the idea that global trade routes, global standards, and global capital flows should be shaped by Washington or Brussels. China is building parallel institutions, parallel routes, and ultimately, parallel systems of influence. This is what makes the economic battlefield global now. It's not just competition over goods or markets. It's competition over the architecture of the entire system. Who controls the routes? Who sets the rules? Who finances the infrastructure that everything else runs on? China is betting that in the 21st century, the great powers won't be defined by who has the biggest navy or the biggest economy outright, but by who controls the connectivity of the world. Belt and Road is both a map and a strategy. And every country that plugs into it becomes another node in a network that extends China's reach far beyond its borders. So when we look at global tension today, we can't just talk about militaries or diplomatic summits. We have to talk about ports in Djibouti, rail lines in Pakistan, highways across Central Asia, and deep water harbors in the Mediterranean. Because every one of those projects is a move on the board. Every one is a shift in power. And taken together, they represent the most ambitious geoeconomic project in the modern era. The economic battlefield isn't just national, it's planetary. And China understood that earlier than almost anyone else, because they do take the long view of things. When we talk about conflict today, it's easy to picture armies, missiles, and airstrikes. But that's not where most modern conflict starts. It starts long before a single soldier moves. It starts with the economy. Sanctions, tariffs, embargoes, export bans, currency manipulation. These aren't just policy decisions. They're strategic tools. They're the opening moves in conflict that may never go hot, but absolutely reshape the world. And if we look closely, we see the same patterns repeating over and over. Countries test each other's resolve economically before they ever consider kinetic force. Think about sanctions. On paper, they're meant to pressure governments into changing behavior. In practice, they do something else. They weaken societies, disrupt markets, and push entire nations into crisis. When you cut off access to global banking, when you block essential exports, when you deny technology transfers, you're not just creating an inconvenience. You're shaping the strategic landscape. You're increasing the political cost of resistance. You're signaling that you're willing to escalate. Tariffs work the same way. A tariff isn't just a tax, it's a challenge. It says we're willing to hurt your industries to protect our own, and we're willing to take the hit ourselves. That's not economics. That's brinksmanship. And once you normalize economic confrontation, it becomes easier to escalate to the next step. Think about it like this. If you spent years treating a rival like an economic adversary, it becomes far more natural, almost inevitable, to start treating them like a military one. History is full of examples. The U.S. oil embargo on Japan didn't just spark economic hardship. It accelerated Japan's decision to go to war. The sanctions on Iraq throughout the 1990s didn't prevent conflict. They set the stage for it. Trade wars in the early 20th century didn't cool tensions between world powers. They inflamed them. Economic warfare rarely ends the story. More often, it writes the first chapters. And today, economic confrontation is everywhere. The U.S. and China are locked in a duel over semiconductors, rare earths, and supply chains. Russia and Europe fought a quiet war through energy pipelines, long before tanks ever crossed the border. Even smaller states are learning how to weaponize currency, food exports, and critical minerals to force concessions. This is the part people miss. These aren't isolated events. They're part of a broader shift. The global economy is no longer a neutral space where nations politely compete. It's a battlefield where every policy is a tactical move, every trade agreement a strategic alignment, every export restriction is a warning shot, every disrupted supply chain is a vulnerability exposed. And because the world is so interconnected, economic warfare hits harder than ever. A semiconductor ban affects entire industries. A maritime blockade affects global food prices. An energy embargo destabilizes entire regions. What used to be national pressure points are now global shockwaves. This is why the stakes are so high. When economic conflict becomes the norm, the boundary between economic confrontation and military confrontation gets blurry. Sanctions, tariffs, and trade wars, they might not be kinetic, but they can create the desperation, the fear, and the political pressure that make kinetic conflict more likely. That's not theory. That's not academic. It's happening now. The modern battlefield isn't just land, sea, air, or cyberspace. It's the economy itself. And every decision, every restriction, every retaliation, every supply chain realignment is part of the larger game of power, pressure, and posturing. Whether we call it war or not, the effects are the same. When we step back from the individual pieces, the supply chain fragility, the populist backlash, the geopolitical realignments, the rise of economic statecraft, what comes into focus is a much larger truth. The economy isn't the side story. It's the main stage on which modern power operates. The financial system, the global marketplace, the flow of goods and energy. These aren't just indicators of national health. They're the tools, the weapons, and the battlegrounds of the 21st century. For decades, we were taught to think of economics as something separate from conflict, separate from geopolitics, separate from national survival. The economy was a dashboard reading, GDP, inflation, interest rates, technical, dry, removed from the visceral machinery of political power. Tanks and jets were the instruments of war. Markets and currency were the instruments of policy. But the world we live in today has erased that divide completely. Deregulation didn't just free markets. It reshaped who wields influence. Globalization didn't just integrate economies. It bound them together so tightly that a rupture anywhere sent shock waves everywhere. And inequality didn't just create winners and losers. It created political volatility on a scale that now redefines elections, alliances, and national identities. What 2008 revealed wasn't simply financial malpractice. It showed us how deeply integrated and fragile the entire system has become. One failure in one sector of one country brought the global economy to the brink. And while we survived it, barely, we didn't fix the underlying architecture. We papered over the cracks with liquidity, bailouts, for the billionaires, austerity, for us, and denial. Meanwhile, the world kept moving. The grievances created during the recovery years hardened into ideology. Populism rose as millions of people concluded, rightly, that the system no longer served them. Supply chains grew longer and more brittle, turning everyday necessities into potential pressure points. Emerging powers began rewriting the rules, building alternate networks of influence. And nations rediscovered the power of economic coercion through sanctions, tariffs, debt, and financial choke points. Tools that can cripple an economy more efficiently than any army. This is the new reality. Conflict has become economic before it becomes kinetic. We are now watching national strategy shift towards strangling rivals financially, isolating them technologically, and weakening them through market leverage. We're watching industries become political assets, commodities become bargaining chips, and infrastructure become fault lines in a global competition. And we're watching ordinary people, workers, families, entire communities, absorb the impact long before the headlines catch up. So the key idea is this. If we treat the economy as background noise, we will misread everything that happens around us. We'll misunderstand why alliances are shifting. We'll misunderstand why countries lash out or shut down. We'll misunderstand why populism keeps surging, why supply chains keep failing, why debts keep spiraling, why sanctions keep escalating, and why the next major conflict may not start with soldiers crossing a border, but with a currency crisis, a resource embargo, or a technology cutoff. 2008 wasn't an anomaly. It was the opening chapter of a new era, one where power is increasingly exercised through markets, supply chains, energy flows, and financial instruments. The spark was lit more than a decade ago, and the fire has been spreading ever since. Through trade wars, through political polarization, through economic fragmentation, through the quiet weaponization of interdependence. The question now isn't whether we can go back to the old model. Spoiler, we can't. The question is whether we understand the world we're already in well enough to navigate what comes next. Because if we don't, we'll be blindsided. Not by events that came out of nowhere, but by forces that have been right in front of us all along, shaping our future while we were still pretending they were just economic issues.